What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I say, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Mershazde, and boy, do we have a special guest. Matthew Dunn is in the house. What's up, Matthew?
Hi, thanks for having me on your show.
Oh, man, I'm so pumped to have you here. Gosh, Matthew, so our team has scoured the earth, literally earth. I know what most of our guests are North American, but we get some people from outside of North America every now and again. But we scoured the earth looking for the best guests for the show. And one of our hunting rounds is a former guest, Jordan Harbinger, on the show. And so my team reached out to your team and yourself, and we're so excited to have you here on The Greatest Machine, and really just pumped to have you come and teach us all the things that you've done, all the greatness that you've lived in your life, and to share it with our audience. So I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for coming on the show and welcome you to The Greatest Machine. So thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure.
So the audience, you guys might be like, well, who's this person? You guys maybe haven't heard of Matthew quite yet. And one of the things that drew us to Matthew was, as you guys know, I'm a curious individual, and Matthew is he's what we call a former intelligence officer from the UK. And so I was like, oh man, I want to talk to a spy. And we've had one other spy on the show who has taught us a lot of amazing stuff. And we live in such a crazy world right now. I was like, man, I can't wait to hear what you have to say about all things spy related, as well as maybe we can get into the topic of creativity, because I know that's near and dear to your heart. But before we go there, what I'd love to do is give a quick overview of your bio, and then we love origin stories here at The Greatness Machine. Would love to hear some of your origin stories. I doubt you just were like 2 years old and we're like, man, I'm going to be like a spy kid. It happened probably over time as you went to university and whatnot. But if you don't mind, I'd love to give your bio, and then we could go straight into your origin story. Does that work for you, Matthew?
Oh, that works perfect.
Awesome. So, guys, Matthew Dunn is coming out of the UK. He's a former MI6 intelligence officer, aka Secret Intelligence Service, best-selling author of the Spy Catcher series and the Ben Stein series. So he's an amazing author. He's written tons of books, a masterclass as well, mentor in how to write a novel. And it really just a storyteller at heart and keynote speaker on the power of creativity, leadership, and many more. So would love, Matthew, if you could, give us some of your origin story, some of your background. Like I said, I doubt if you just were like snapped your fingers and became a spy, but would love to hear, how you got to where you got to.
Yeah, it was, my childhood, and it's relevant, was actually fairly uneventful. I mean, it was absolutely fine. I grew up in a fairly idyllic part of southern England. Nothing particularly to report. But what I did notice about myself was I had a constant yearning. I always had a sort of sense of looking over the horizon, wondering what's out there. And back then, pre-digital age, my portal, my way out of what was very nice, but very sort of humdrum existence were books. And I used to spend an inordinate amount of time so scouring secondhand bookstores and picking up obscure novels about, adventures in 19th century, early 20th century. And that was my escapism, if you like. And within that, I had fire burning in my belly, constant aspirations of what I want to do when I grow up. And it would change, week on week, month on month. And I was constantly yearning. And one month I want to be an astronaut, the next a ship's captain, the next a diamond smuggler, and the next to escape to the French Foreign Legion. The list would always go on and on and on. And, it was a very healthy, inquiring, imaginative childhood that I had as a result of that. And then once I got into young adulthood, Obviously, then things start to get real, as they do for all of us. And I left school and then spent a bit of time traveling, just doing what I hoped to do and explore parts of the world before actually going to university. And it was at university that things really came to a head and set the compass direction for my subsequent life, because it was there that I was talent spotted, as we would call it, for the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6.
So I have a question on that. So in the States, you know, we have the CIA, which is our intelligence agency. Is MI6 like the UK version of CIA, just for our American listeners to kind of like do a comparison?
Precisely so. And in fact, MI6, which is the oldest global intelligence service, over 100 years old, MI6 actually helped set up the CIA.
Oh, interesting.
As was during during and at the back end of the Second World War. So you can thank us for your CIA, rightly or wrongly. But yeah, so with that expertise, MI6 was really born out of the pre-First World War and learning on the job in those early days. But very much, it's an overseas intelligence organization, so not a domestic security service like, for example, the FBI, or in our case, MI5. MI6, people like me, we go overseas. And very brutally, what we do is we try and steal secrets.
And so with, you know, when you say steal secrets, that, you know, obviously that makes it, well, where do you begin there? I want to go back though. So when you were in school, it sounds like they recruited you. Is that correct? Or did you apply? I know here in the States, my first introduction to people I knew that were trying to get in the CIA was when I was in college. And you know, in the States, we have Ivy League schools, and I had some friends that went to some Ivy League schools. I did not go. I went to a party school, so they weren't out there recruiting us, but they were recruiting my friends out of the Ivy League schools, and I was kind of surprised to see that, because I was like, oh, I guess like that. First of all, that makes sense. If you're like going for an intelligence officer, you probably want people that are at least objectively intelligent, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts on like book smart versus, you know, creative smart. Nowadays we have like so much perspective around what quote unquote intelligence is. But you know, I'm 46 years old, and back then it was like, nope, you know, like how good are you at math? How good are you at reading? You know, writing, all that good stuff. But you know, here in the States, that's where they're recruiting folks out of. Like, were you recruited as in like they came to you, or did you go to them? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It was a weird story there. I mean, just to take a step back, I mean, back to pre-starting university, I mentioned books and being a voracious reader. And then there was one point, I don't know exactly, 14, 15 years old, perhaps, something like that, where I stumbled across Ian Fleming, the author, creator of James Bond. Now, I wasn't particularly familiar with the films, but the books, I was drawn to this notion. There was this suave, uber-intelligent individual who was able to mix in circles around the world. Nobody knew his name, and he also carried a Walther PPK sidearm. And for some reason, I liked the notion of doing something top secret and nobody knowing who I really was. But it was a flight of fancy, I put it down to. However, it didn't go away. And when I was at university, it was in the second year of university, I was working quite closely with one of the professors in the politics department specifically. And in the margins of what we were doing, he took me to one side and said, asked me what was I thinking of doing after I left university. Now, at this point, I had a notion that there might be talent spotters spread across the United Kingdom in primarily universities. Bear in mind, at the time, there was no way to openly apply to MI6. It didn't exist, apart from in the likes of fiction. So no information, no open route. So I did have a notion that if I was to join the MI6, it would be via Talent Spotter. And I then had a notion, I wonder if this politics professor could be one of them. So my response to his question about what I wanted to do was, well, I'm quite interested in working for the government in some kind of foreign service. I use that phrase very deliberately, foreign service, as opposed to our diplomatic corps, which is our Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And he said, that's very interesting. And we had a series of chats, and I kid you not, the series of chats went on for a good year, of him talking to me, just sort of testing the water a bit, and me sort of giving various answers. And it got to a stage, and I'm shorthanding stuff here, but it got to a stage where I think we both knew exactly what we were talking about. And he then, and I was by now in my third year at university, said on one day, he said, look, there's some people in London that I think you should go and have a chat with. And I said, fantastic. I knew exactly what he was talking about, and I'm sure he knew that I knew, and the game went on. But we didn't mention it. We just said, yeah. And he said, they kind of work in foreign service, so go and have a chat. And so that's what I did. Went down to this beautiful, salubrious place in central London, very old building, steeped in history, and met some very, very nice people. And pretty much their opening question to me was, do you know who you're talking to? My response was, yes, you are the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. Their response, yes, we are. Now we've got that out the way, we can have an open discussion. Now, obviously, I've given you a very condensed version of that whole recruitment process, which, looking back, was weird because it's clear to me what this professor and one or two others, by the way, were doing were basically observing me for that year and a half whilst I was at university to see whether I was worthy of being brought to the attention of MI6. And I look back and think, well, that's okay. But what happened thereafter was I went through the process, the selection process, which was as arduous as you can imagine. The cognitive tests, the interviews, the role-playing exercises, more interviews, then ultimately the security vetting process, everything. It's one of the hardest jobs in the world to get into, I believe. And I always look back and think, okay, year and a half of being sort of assessed in this weird thing at university, what would have happened if I'd have failed any one of those subsequent application selection processes, which I could easily have done because it is very torturous. But that was how things were done back then. It's all changed now. There is open application available now, but that didn't exist when I was around. So somehow, despite the odds, I went through that whole process, came to their attention, and went through that whole process right up to the point that I was offered a position to start with the Secret Intelligence Service.
So with that, first of all, it's fascinating. I'm curious. When you got in, and obviously, I'm assuming now your colleagues are other officers, either of various experience. When you look at that job, right? Obviously, regardless if the world's changed, and maybe the type of person or having diversity within the roles maybe is different now than it was then. But regardless of that, they're looking for a certain type of person, right? And they're testing for different elements. If you had to name like the top 2 or 3 elements or 3 or 4 elements that you think that they absolutely are like trying to check a box on, like this person has this, and this, these 3 or 4 things. What do you think were the things that they were really like assessing you for, outside of just like the obvious ones, just like, hey, is this a smart person or a strategic person? But what are the things that they're like, oh, if they don't have these 3 or 4 things, like there's no way?
Well, intellect is a given. I mean, obviously, it may be to an obvious point, but that is one of the key things. But outside of that, I mean, I remember, as an anecdote, talking to a very senior operational officer, intelligence officer, who was doing a stint as head of recruitment at MI6. I was well embedded in the organization, years in by this stage. And I said to him, I knew him, and I said, look, now you're doing this sort of recruiting new entrants, new spies. I said, well, what is it that you're looking for? Why did you and I get in? Oh, as opposed to joining the diplomatic service, for example, or similar. He said, it's really interesting. We have to do all the checklists, all the tests and everything, and we're looking at other things that are very important, such as interpersonal skills, creativity, ability to think outside the box, all of these kind of things. He said, but to be honest, if somebody ticks all of those boxes, what we're left with is nothing more objective than looking for what he described as a particular breed of animal. And he used the analogy that, sometimes it's a case of somebody just literally walks into the room and you look at them and you think, that's the person. That person has got that almost X factor about them. There's something different about them. But on specifics outside of, as I say, the cerebral or intellectual capability, I would say that there is a certain mindset that's quite common within intelligence officers. And one of the key things I've noticed is that we have a different way of looking at the world. We are quite contrarian in that respect. We're not sort of mainstream conventional thinkers. We're always looking at alternative viewpoints or alternative ways of doing things. And that isn't something necessarily that is schooled or honed. It is perhaps something that's more characteristic that can go back to childhood or birth even. So a particular type of person. And it is the obvious comparison in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the States, is difference between MI6 and the diplomatic corps. People who are getting into the diplomatic corps is exceptionally tough. And people who join there are typically got brains the size of small planets, and you think, well, okay, why are they more suited to that role than they are for MI6? And there is a difference. And bearing in mind, MI6 officers have to pose as diplomats as well, by the way, when they're overseas. But there is a difference, and it's just that sort of je ne sais quoi, something slightly different about them that stands them out. But I'd love to give you objective criteria over and above what I've already given you. But sometimes there's just something a little bit different about this person.
When you, it was funny, I was listening to, I just did this cross-country road trip with my family I live in Austin, Texas, but I'm from California. And Texas, you may or may not know this, in the summer is really hot. It's like super, super hot here. And so I'm like, oh, I got to get the hell out of here. It's like, I can't be here. I just got back on Saturday and I'm like, oh God, now I know why I leave. But we were driving, so we were listening to a lot of podcasts. And I was listening to a podcast, the new podcast there's a guy that used to be on TV here named Johnny Knoxville, who's an actor. And he has a new podcast around like extreme athletes. And one of them was a base jumper. This guy does base jumping, which is like one of the deadliest sports in the world. And one of the guys said, he's this world famous base jumper. He said it's something you can't not do. Because there's every reason not to do it. So I think to your point, like it's born within. When you look at the candidates, and I don't know if you were involved in the selection process of candidates after you were in. Were you involved in that? Is there, once you're in, are you part of the recruiting process? Or is that a separate job?
I wasn't, not for cadre MI6 officers, but of course a huge part of what I did was recruitment of foreign spies, foreign nationals.
Interesting.
That was the lifeblood. The same will apply for CIA. It's human intelligence. Where do we get that from? We get that from individuals, human beings who have proximity, access to high priority secrets that are deemed crucial for whatever reason. And so a large part of what I would do would be identifying such individuals and then working out, okay, how can I get alongside them wherever they are, sometimes in very hostile overseas locations, get alongside them typically under alias cover, pretending to be something completely different, businessman, academic, or whatever it will be. And then ultimately the end game being, hopefully at some point, recruiting them to do what is the biggest ask of all, which is betray their country, become a traitor. And in the sort of course of doing that, not only risking their life, but also very often the lives of their loved ones, their family, extended family, etc. So I will be making the biggest pitch of all, in that respect, in that recruitment terminology.
So as you say that, I was thinking of a few things. Like, first of all, what stands out to me in this is that, and this is, I think right now more than ever, this is probably more of a relevant strength that's getting more play than any time in history, is this notion of EQ, right? High levels of emotional intelligence. And it's funny, like we're in this world of AI, and when I hear people talk about AI, and I've been exploring this a lot recently, one of the things that comes up is they're like, well, high EQ jobs, that's really, you can't outsource that to AI. And so, but I'm hearing you say that, which is, super high EQ, like being able to read people and understand what their needs and wants are, and putting yourself in their shoes. That sounds like a kind of a big box that you're assessing for, either from the perspective of assets that you're trying to get to trade, betray their country or the groups that they're supporting, or from the perspective of officers. Is that something that do you consider yourself someone of high emotional intelligence?
I do, and it was 100% something that MI6 was insistent on in terms of the people it would recruit. I'm sure there are different ways different agencies do things, but the way MI6 would do things, it would look for intelligence officers or potential intelligence officers who really did have that ability, as you say, the ability to read people. Not necessarily, chapter and verse, but the ability to read somebody with a view to assessing whether they could actually do what was asked of them. So very, very quick, very rifle shot decision making in terms of, making an assessment of somebody. And we would call it using our antennae. So we wouldn't, MI6, we were never a big fan, by the way, of various different latest psychology kind of stuff. In fact, MI6 didn't and still doesn't recruit psychologists. It doesn't believe in that. It really relies on the gift of the individual and the ability to read people accurately. And crucially, I mean, that accurate read can have life consequences if you get it wrong. So that EQ, as you describe it, was absolutely crucial. The ability to not only think intellectually in terms of problem solving and all that comes with that, but also have a real understanding of what I call the human condition. And the human condition, obviously, cross-border, wherever you are in the world, whichever gender you are, whatever age, whatever cultural backgrounds, ideologies, belief systems, or whatever. There's certain things that make people tick wherever they are, and the ability to really, in a benign way, get under the skin of that person.
When you going back to getting into the MI6, once you were in, what does that like onboarding training look like? As far as, I don't know how specific you can get, but what are they doing to get you ready to become an intelligence officer? Because I'm thinking of, like, here in the United States, I have a few friends that are special ops for military, and that process is brutal. I mean, really brutal. Even my wife's a member of her family married a former intelligence officer who was an Army Ranger, and he wanted to do intelligence in the special forces, which was a combination of, he had to go through Ranger school here, and then he became an intelligence officer. So is it a combination of physical and technical training? Is it just technical training? Like, I'd love to hear like kind of a snapshot of, hey, once you're in, what does it look like to get you ready to actually go do the work?
Yeah, it was exceptionally intense. And the interesting thing for me and for the others I joined up with there's about 30 of us new entrants in total, is I joined in the mid-1990s, and there was, despite going through that rigorous selection process as I've described, there was this nagging worry that, okay, Cold War's over, Soviet Union's collapsed, so, what are the likes of MI6 doing now? Is my job now just going to be some kind of boring desk job, or just chasing after sort of, I don't know, lowly international criminals or something like that, something fairly humdrum? And it was actually on day one of the training course, which, by the way, was 6 months, day one, that they do it. And they do it very cleverly. They open the books about what it is they're doing and what it is they have done. And they get former, senior operation officers or retired officers, or in some cases defectors from Russia and elsewhere, giving case studies. And so you sat there listening to this stuff, and our jaws were literally on the ground, because what happened was we realized, my goodness me, Not only is this business as usual, but it is infinitely more complex and more dangerous. And that was the world that I'd entered. And the training, 6-month intelligence officers course, was as intense as you can imagine to reflect that reality. It starts out a lot of role play exercises. It starts out quite fun, to be honest with you. But then it gets more and more serious as it goes through. There is physical aspect to it, of course, but a lot of it is the mental side of things. And the escalation, the ever-increasing intensity to it culminates in a big final exercise that is starts in the UK and then migrates overseas. And you do it alone. I mean, everything is done emphasizing operating alone, by the way, because that's the reality of the work. It's not like, we see it in the movies where people are operating in teams or this and the other, or somebody is on their own, but suddenly they can call in the cavalry or get satellite coverage overhead. That was never the case, never is the case. It's a solo job, largely, and you're trained as such for that. And in this final exercise, the way they gear it is such that it gets to a stage where you no longer know if this is a training exercise. In my case, and it happened to others, we'd swap notes at the end of it all. But in my case, getting arrested and then wondering, well, actually, is this for real? And getting treated as if it was for real for a few days. And what they're looking for is to see if you're going to crack. And so all of that. And then, of course, then there is, to your point about the special operations side of things. Always remember that as an MI6 spy, we are A to Z spies, as I describe it. So, because we're operating on our own, we have to know how to do everything because there is no backup. So that will include unarmed combat, small arms, explosives, infiltration, exfiltration, all of that, as well as all the technical stuff, as well as basic level or basic military level of medical provision in case one gets injured overseas, as I have on occasion. All of these things, you need to be able to do it all because you will not have anyone who can come in and patch you up or give you support or whatever. So we need to know everything. And so that includes special forces training, for example, and other very specialist training within that program. Then after the 6 months, then at that point, then you go straight into an operational team. And in my case, that was headquartered out of London, targeting senior echelons of rogue states. That was my gig. That was what I was in. And I kind of thought, again, nobody tells you what's going to happen, but I thought, well, okay, it's going to be a sort of gentle ease in to it. And it wasn't. It was straight into the lion's den, straight into operations. And that's really where it all started for me. Now, from going back to the training aspect of it, of course, throughout my career, and there's lots of other training stuff that I did. That's part of the career path. So you dip in and out back to training for various specialist things. And in my case, there was one very, very extended paramilitary course that I did that I had to do, and that was full on what we call special forces with our SAS and SBS, the equivalent of your SEAL Team 6 and Delta. So that's part of it. Depends on the career path of the operational officer and what they're doing. And ultimately, everything works back from the objective. What is it that the likes of MI6 wants its operational officer to do?
What going back, I have like literally 6 questions right now, so I want to pound through these quickly because I don't want to forget them. Number one, going back to that when they brought in the beginning of training where they were kind of giving you like essentially context of the state of the world. This is post fall of the Soviet Union. When you say your jaws dropped, was it because they're like, yeah, the Soviet Union fell, but here's all the crazy shit that's happening right now that you need to be aware of? Like, what was it that made you guys that blew your minds if you had this concern about, oh, the world's a safe place now? What was like the big aha moment? Like, oh no, things are as complex as ever.
Yeah, well, you summed it up there with, everything's gone to shit. It really was because the Soviet Union collapses and Then everything fragments. Everything, and as we know, of course, with the ascension of Russia, its ambition was capitalism, come what may, and with that came crime and everything else. With that and the desperate grab from Russia's perspective to become this capitalist empire and rebuild on those lines, and so. Russia's activities, if anything, became exceptionally more aggressive, much more hostile in terms of what they were doing. So from an intelligence perspective, countering that activity was massive. And then, of course, within the mix, you look at that fragmentation, and we don't need to get into the weeds of this all, but the fragmentation of the Soviet Union and its allies, there were massive concerns, such as nuclear arsenals. And also conventional weaponry, who's got what's going to happen to it, et cetera, et cetera. So it was certainly my perspective, and I joined at this time. It was a mad scrabble of trying to counter or gain intelligence or disrupt in some cases a raft of different activities. And of course, there were other things going on in the world at the time as well. Certainly when I joined, one of the key things I was at the back end of, for example. The Balkans conflict, you may remember, Slavia, things like that was going on. China was on the ascension. The Middle East was always the Middle East doing its thing, so that, so we were looking at this, it was quite literally a case of looking at the map of the world with, seasoned MI6 operatives telling us what they were doing. Thinking, my goodness me, how on earth are we going to make a dent in any of all this? And yeah, that's what we had to do.
Yeah,
from an exploration perspective, I don't think there wasn't one of us, a new entrant, who suddenly thought, my goodness me, this is going to be, fairly boring routine. The opposite, and I do wonder now, whether any of us, I didn't, but whether any of the others were having second thoughts about whether this was the career for them. If they had aspirations to some fairly easy diplomatic type circuit, picking up snippet type career, that was blown away, as I say, literally within day one of joining.
I have a question on that. So first of all, you said there's 30 people in your class. Like, did all 30 make it through? Or did people, I mean, it sounds like the selection process is really hard. That would weed a lot of people out. Were there people that once they got into it and there was an escalation of training where they got cut or they didn't, or they dropped out? Was that a thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The obvious comparison in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same for your tier one special forces units in the US. If we take, for example, SAS and SBS, I hope those acronyms are familiar to your listeners. But as I say, the likes of Delta or SEAL Team 6. Now, usually the way they work is that they'll have around about 120 applicants who are considered for selection for the likes of the SAS. And what they want to do is weed that down to about 8 to 10 by the end of the process. Yeah, it's a massive, massive weeding out process done through severe attrition. The hardest special forces selection in the world to get into the SAS and SBS. So that's how they work. Whereas with MI6, it's by the time you're through the front door to start day one of that 6-month training, they actually want to keep you because all that weeding out has been done. You become a precious commodity by this stage. That you really are in their eyes just one of a very, very small, minute percentage of Great Britain could do this job. So they actually want to get you through the training course. Now, there are people who, despite everything, still do fail. But really, that whole selection process has been done by the time. Their motivation is to try to get you through. Because by this stage, by day one of training, something will have gone wrong if they've got the wrong person. So they should have the right person, and it's really then a case of giving them the skills to do it. That said, I mean, there were 2 people on my course. One person was failed, and another person left through his own volition, decided it wasn't for him. So there is attrition. But by that stage, the thousands and thousands of people who would have been considered, they've already been weeded out before the training starts.
Is there any data, or was there? So that's interesting. Like a lot of the filtering happens pre-selection or through the selection process. Post graduation, right now you're like, yay, I'm gonna go, protect the world, and in a really dangerous way. It's interesting that I can't remember. I was hearing someone talk about these different jobs with high, more, essentially like death rates. What is like? Is there a percentage of like, hey, there's a 25% of all these officers like get killed in the line of duty? It sounds like if you're out there individually, rubbing elbows with, folks that are trying to do harm to the world, that there's a chance that you either A, get discovered, or B, you're just kind of in a bad situation and things go down. Was there any data points of like, hey, this is your survival rate in this job? I'm curious if you guys had that information.
Yeah, I've got to be very careful with putting percentages on it. I'd love to, but there's obviously quite a confidential issue. But let me address the principle, though, that without doubt, being an MI6 spy and other agency spies as well, but in my mind, without doubt, being an MI6 spy is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, without a shadow of doubt.
Wow. Okay.
No support, no nothing, and everything you're doing. Now, in my case, I always knew, and it's people are upfront about it. I always knew that if I got caught, then I'd have no safety net. That at best I'd receive life imprisonment. The country that caught me, or at worst, I'd be put up against a wall and shot, possibly after a protracted period of torture. That never really bothered me, or I never really thought about it for various reasons. I just wanted to get the job done. But where it is very relevant and very close to my heart is my agents, what I think you would call in the States your assets, the foreign individuals that I would recruit, male, female, young, old, all different walks of life, different backgrounds, different shapes, sizes, colors, you name it. Because for me, they were precious commodity. Remarkable individuals, gifted amateurs. They were given training by people like me on the ground, in situ, in country, but they weren't trained spies like me. But they were vital because they had access to information secrets that were deemed relevant to the powers that be. And then they put their lives in my hands. I was their case officer, meeting them covertly around the world in whichever location. If you can imagine your stereotypical sort of smoky hotel room in Istanbul or similar, wherever it was, you'd have these meetings. And they knew that, I was the person who was deploying them to this exceptionally risky job of going back to their country, to their job, whatever it would be, to steal secrets and all the repercussions that could happen if they got caught. They knew that I was the one who was sending them, and yet they also entrusted me and put their faith in me. And it was a bizarre dynamic there. Here I was, even if I was, late 20s, sitting opposite somebody in their 60s or even 70s or whatever, I became almost like a father figure to them, saying them, looking at the eye, sometimes, when their hands are shaking or tears are rolling down their face, saying it's okay. Draw strength from me. I'm here. I will help you. Everything goes wrong, I will be the one who come and get you out. This is it. We can do this together. And various things within that, because of course, then the sense within myself of what was I doing, with these wonderful people. Yes, for the greater good, of course. But I knew what I was doing, and they knew I knew, and all the rest of it. And so a very strange dynamic, not least because my agents, these foreign nationals, were for me way closer to me than I think a typical family member would be. It was because it was such an extraordinary relationship. Born out of, the most severe jeopardy.
Yeah, that sounds super intense. I have two questions. One is, did you have a specialty? Were you like, oh, I'm I don't know if you have to learn a second language or a couple languages, but did you have a specialty or a focus as a an officer? Like, what was or part of the world that you worked in most? Was there any of that going on for you?
No, and MI6 doesn't encourage, in its operational offices, does not encourage specialisms. It can happen by default. Certain persons tends to operate in a particular part of the world because of, for example, languages or whatever. But really, they prefer people to be generalists. And the reason for that is because in the course of doing operational work, for example, I targeted very, very specific rogue states as we defined them. The big guys, the nasty guys, the ones who could ultimately cause World War III. That's what I did. But at the same time, because of the nature of the work, I could be meeting an agent or another, asset associate or whatever, and glean intelligence about something completely different. I needed to have the wherewithal to be able to process that other intelligence as well. So it's an all-round, a well-rounded intelligence officer is what MI6 wants. The ability to have an understanding of other issues outside of the specific focus that one's looking at. But officers, as I mentioned, can tend to gain a particular focus, whether it be geographic or whether it be down to language or whatever. As I mentioned earlier, I, for example, gained considerably more training and experience on certain other, what we call direct action techniques, paramilitary stuff. Other officers, that wasn't really their bag. They were more adept at, sort of speaking Mandarin in the corridors of Beijing or whatever. And so everyone played to their strengths a little bit, but there was no case of us being put into a particular box. Within MI6, like the CIA, there will be departments that contain specialists, whether it be technical attack or translation, that kind of thing. But the operation officers, like the CIA, they've got to be able to do everything.
Got it. And so with your with what you were doing as a generalist, are you allowed to talk about any of the work you did, or is that off limits? I should have asked before the show.
I can. No, I can't talk about specific operations, as we call them, missions, as I think you call them in the States. I can't talk about that, but I can try to talk in general terms as much as possible. But I mean, what I can, to give you a flavour of a lot of what I would do, would be going overseas on my own, undercover, under alias, as we call it. Now, the alias, and at peak I had 14 aliases. An alias wouldn't just mean having a dodgy passport and credit card. It would be having an entire life, or at least having a life that can withstand scrutiny by interrogators or even casual questions at the airport, for example, or wherever, one might encounter questions. So, for example, I would have alias John Smith. Alias John Smith would have a real home address, and I'd need to know that home address. I'd need to know the street that home address was on. I'd need to know the local pubs in the area, the local cafes. I'd need to know what beers were on draft in that local pub. I'd need to know which schools I went to. I'd need to know the names of teachers that taught me at those schools. I'd need to have a friendship network. I'd need to potentially have hobbies, interests, and memberships attached therein. A whole raft of things, so that if somebody did question me, I could come across as a real person with depth attached to it. And of course, the job I was doing under that alias, I'd need to have sufficient depth of knowledge attached to that as well. It's no good pretending to be, I don't know, a nuclear physicist if I don't know much about nuclear physics. So I would always choose a vocation job that I felt confident I could carry off, that also fitted the operation, a requirement to get alongside a target, as we call the human person we wanted to approach, but also something I could carry off in the process.
Well, did you have a favorite vocation that you used, like, more consistently than others?
Yeah, I can talk about that. I mean, as I say, we played to our strengths, and I felt very comfortable portraying a businessman, largely. I did other things as well, academic stuff and various things. But businessman, I felt quite confident in that role. I felt it was, a good thing to navigate the world with, and it came with downsides. But it was something that I think played to my strengths. So I would sort of go in, for example, and pretend to be some big swinging sort of consultant or CEO type and all the rest of it, and carry the character accordingly. That was something that I was quite enthused at. And by the way, it was very rare to be told by MI6 what cover we had to deploy. It was always down to the operation officer. Would look at a potential case, look at a target, look at how could that be done, and MI6 would rely on the judgment of the officer who actually had to go out and do it. Because, after all, there's no point telling the officer to do something that he or she would feel uncomfortable with. So I would be there looking at information given to me by my support officers, my targeting officers, etc., thinking, okay, blimey, blank sheet of paper territory. How am I going to do this? Who am I going to be? What role am I going to play? And all this kind of stuff. And, within that dynamic, could be done out of headquarters in London, Vauxhall London, MI6, then, I could, come up with various different ideas, different notions. And I always used to think, if you give the same operation to 10 operation officers, those 10 officers will all come up with 10 different ideas.
Right.
And they'd all be great ideas, different covers, different ideas, different notions, all the rest of it. And that was great. So deploying undercover, under alias, and I would be that alias from the moment I stepped out of my front door in London, typically. So boarding a flight out of, for example, Heathrow Airport or whatever, I would be undercover, and I would be living that role. I would be that person. Then, overseas, obviously being the person, and constantly attuned to not just aggressive questioning from police or countries' security services, but also the chance encounters, for example, or random questions at arrivals in country from immigration or security desk or whatever. And I've had that. I've had situations where arrived in a country and somebody's just doing the routine. There I am in a queue, routine checks of passports and everything, and a couple of random questions, and one of which was, which university do you teach at? Because that was my cover. And then the guy behind the counter, different nationality, face lit up and said, well, I did my PhD at that university. Oh, you must know so-and-so. You must know so-and-so. And, oh, how's that department doing? And what's this? And I had the ability to answer that random thing because, of course, if I started stuttering or making mistakes, then that person could have got suspicious, and then it could have escalated.
Yeah.
So being able to carry that cover off and then ultimately getting closer and closer to the target person or target installation or whatever it was my job entailed, and that's then the cold face activity of the reason why you're there.
When one question about these different personas and coming in as first of all, it sounded like you it's almost like method acting, like you became the person. Did you change your physical appearance at all for these different parts?
I have done that. I've done it. I mean, I've worn wigs and facial hair, and back in the 90s, I think technology's changed now. I've made myself look, really tanned. I hope technology's changed, because back then the creams, our disguise department, and we had one. You'd end up looking at your skin and it'll be all streaky or whatever. But I've worn all sorts of stuff, disguise and stuff. But ultimately, most operational officers like myself, we didn't particularly like it because we wanted to carry off the persona. We wanted it to be real. And of course, things can go wrong if you're wearing a wig, for example.
Right.
Then, okay, you've got to have a reason for wearing a wig because, again, the flashpoints, entry and exit of countries in particular, other places as well. But, you get taken to one side and then you get more thoroughly checked for whatever reason, and including physically checked, then you've got to have a reason why you're wearing a blonde wig or whatever it is type thing. Now, a wig is, okay, you're vain about hair loss or whatever it is, but a fake moustache, there's no explanation for that, or whatever. So you've got to be very, very careful with, why you're wearing a disguise or whatever. So if you can avoid it, avoid it. Avoid anything that brings any suspicion on yourself.
Yeah, it's got to be natural. So how long? I know. Gosh, I'm like, I should have booked a longer show for us. Like I'm just getting started, Matthew. How long were you an officer for before you moved into your second mountain, your second career as a novelist? I would love to touch on that a little bit, but how long were you an officer for before you moved away from that?
Okay, so I have to be, unfortunately, this isn't going to be, you're not going to be pleased with me. I'll have to be vague about it. Many, many years.
Okay.
The reason why I have to be vague about the exact number of years is because on the latter part of my career, there were sensitivities attached to stuff. So but all you need to know was a long stint. What I can say was that I started my writing career in 2001. And that was really born out of just the dream. I always loved fiction as a child, as I mentioned, and I loved creative writing. That was one of my favorite subjects. When I was at school as a youngster, at least. And I was in my early 40s, and I always had this notion, well, okay, I always thought about writing a book, and circumstances allowed me. I was back in the UK. Circumstances allowed me to consider it, and I thought, well, you've got no excuse now. So that's what I did. I wrote with no understanding of how the system worked or whatever. I just wrote a story and submitted it to literary agents without mentioning, by the way, that I was former MI6. I think I'd said I was a diplomat or something like that in the covering letter. I wrote a spy novel and got the usual number of rejections, as you would expect, but persevered. And then one literary agent didn't bit on the whole thing and invited me up to London, and it went from there. Again, it was looking back on it now, it was despite the odds kind of process, and I was unaware of the odds against it at the time. I just thought, I'd just go for it, just do it. And so that's been it, and it really started my whole creative career since. I've now written 14 novels, but also I do other things, as you mentioned in your introduction, which take up a huge amount of my time, but all with the theme of creativity and all with the theme of storytelling, which is at heart, that's really what I am. But it's also worth mentioning that there is a theme, because I look back, everything I did in MI6 was creative. We spoke about aliases, but also thinking about how to do operations, how to think on your feet, how to think creatively when things go wrong. And they always do go wrong, always, even when planned to the nth degree. How to, improvise, how to do, get out of situations or steer things in a different direction. So creativity has been a theme throughout my life, essentially. I'm now 55. It's been the one thing that has been a constant.
Yeah, it's so interesting. God, I had one more question about the job, and then I want to talk about creativity. And I'm like, which one do I want? I'm gonna go with creativity because we're gonna run out of time. So with the creativity, I consider myself a creative, and so even like this show's one avenue of creativity. I wrote a book, and so but I'm a business person. I'm in private equity. It's actually my day job, and I love that too. But you said something that kind of sparked a thought in my mind, which is I feel like in a world where information's more available, automation's happening, task management's becoming kind of commoditized. Creativity is the ability to think on your feet, to come up and problem solve, to I call it turning things inside out, like just being able to hit things from different angles without, and to do it with abundance seems like such a more valuable skill set than ever before, to capitalize on as these other skill sets are essentially being automated. Is there a way that you think about as far as developing creativity or building that creativity muscle, or is it just something that just has come naturally and you just do it because it's there? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean the adage that we're either born creative or we're not. I challenge that. I think we can develop creativity within ourselves. Now, if you think about it, I think all children are born creative. They have great imaginations and they're inquisitive, irrespective of intellect or background or whatever. It just is naturally. And, much like the human sixth sense, which becomes quashed because we just don't need it, but it doesn't disappear. I think creativity is always there. But what happens is life gets in the way.
Mm-hmm.
We reach adolescence, for example, and that's a biggie. and all the challenges that come with that. And then it's leaving home, it's getting a job, it's then, relationships, it's challenges, it's raising a family, or whatever it is you decide you want to do with your life. But it takes a whole lot of time, and within which, if we are to achieve things, there is a sense of getting a little bit tunnel visioned, and being more closed-minded to things that you and I would potentially consider to be creative. And so what happens with a lot of people is they dampen that innate creativity, the creativity they were born with. And I think it's absolutely there to be had for the likes of you and I and others to turn around and say, well, that's okay, because we can rekindle it in you. And it can be. You mentioned I run masterclasses for how to write a novel with adult students. And part of that is that process of me saying, look, okay, let's reawaken that in you. Look at a photo of a fairly, ordinary, drab street and say, okay, who lives in this street? And I say, well, I don't know. So no. Well, let's start imagining it, and you start retraining, regearing the brain, and it's all doable. And of course, what it does in the process is it opens up a whole new world for people. I mean, my students, for example, are coming to me later on saying, my goodness me, they're starting to see the world totally different, and it brings joy to their life. The ability to actually start, even in the smallest things or the drabbest things, starting seeing interesting things. So rekindling, reteaching creativity, 100%, it can be done. And indeed, it should be done, because it is a joyous thing, as I mentioned, wonderful for one's well-being, mental health, all that comes with it, and tremendously useful for problem solving and achieving.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so funny, as you were saying that, I was thinking, like, the world we live in, this industrial, complex, automated digital world. I think for those people that aren't naturally inclined to go and seek creativity like themselves, that it to your point, it does kind of admonish it. It smothers it to a certain degree. The school system we're in smothers creativity. There's a data point I read recently that said, I think it was like, there's a test for genius that they did it throughout the lives of children, and it was, I think, when they were 5 or 6 years old, it was like 60% of the kids were like deemed genius using this testing system, and by the time they graduated high school, it was like 2%. It was the same people, because they were kind of turning these things off as what made them genius, right? And so I agree. I think creativity begets creativity, and good on you to say what you just said, because I think most people, they tend to your point, get busy with life, and then they turn off creativity. This show, like what we're doing right now, was based on me like having like a midlife crisis and saying like, fuck this, I want to go and be creative, because I wasn't being creative and it was pissing me off and making me feel like unmotivated. And so I did the show. So when you think of, I know we're running and we only have a few more minutes left, and gosh, I could go with you for another hour. I didn't get asked probably half the questions I want to ask. What's next for you? You've written a bunch of books. You're doing amazing keynote speaking. You're teaching the masterclass. I mean, like, tell us, like, what's the next big chapter? You're at an age in your life right now where you have a lot of good years ahead of you to do awesome stuff. Like, what's the mountain you're trying to climb right now?
Just keep going. I mean, I'm blessed that actually I can do all these creative things. It's my passion. It's what I love doing. So I've always got projects on the go. I mean, at the moment, for example, I'm just finishing off a TV script for a 6-part drama. I've got 2 theatre scripts on the go. There's discussions underway about a national programme for that. By the way, I'm also in collaboration try my hand at a podcast as well. You'll be pleased to hear, not one that will compete with yours, but constantly lots of different strings to my bow. And there's no for me, the sort of mountains are every day. I constantly think, right, I want to do something else. So, I want to develop what I've got. I want to execute the project I've got and get it up and running or whatever. I'm very much somebody who never stands still. I sort of rage against having a quiet day, or in my parlance, a dull day. Life's too short. Let's grab it and let's go for it. And and that will always be the case, for me, as long as I can keep thinking and keep doing and everything else like that. I will never stop, because it's wonderful. I mean, we're only, I think, at least on this planet once, and so let's make the most of it and live life to the full. So my mountains, I've got various mountains at the moment. If we speak again in a year's time, I'll have new mountains, and all for the great and good. It's wonderful, and on it goes.
I love it, man. Well, I want to have our audience kind of give a bunch of clues as to how they can connect with you. But before we go there, I'd love us to go to our greatness question. I know I prepped you for it before the show, but you ready for the greatness question, Matthew Dunn?
Try. Give it your best.
All right. So, what is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how did you overcome it?
Overcoming it is, it's mundanity. Never, ever accept mundanity. Always strive for a fascinating, exhilarating life.
I love it, man. Matthew, so I want to put this in the show notes. How can people learn more about the work you're doing? I know obviously they can go to Amazon and get the books, but where can they connect with you? Where can they learn more? Give us the rigmarole of how people can learn more and connect with you.
Yeah, I'm all over social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and I've also got a website, MatthewDunnAuthor.com. Very easy. But then again, if you just Google Matthew Dunn Spy, you'll find me so easily. So very easy for your listeners to track me down.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and put that. My team will put that in the show notes. And my gosh, well, that hour just flew by. I swear this was such a fascinating conversation. So much gratitude having you here on the show with us, Matthew, and appreciate all the work you're doing and continue to do. And looking forward to all the projects and accomplishments that you'll be crushing in the future. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Guys, here at the Greatness Machine, we are givers. So go ahead, share this with whoever needs to hear it. I think there's so many pearls of wisdom that Matthew taught us today. Until next time, peace out. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers. And after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.